Good morning.
Good morning.
Chad just mentioned that Kenny and Beth are not here this morning, and I would just want to say that I agree with Chad that we need to pray that they can get some much needed rest. But all of you that know Kenny and Beth will understand when I say that they're probably not resting. I say this because they are two of the hardest working, most servant-hearted people I've ever met, and I'm sure you guys would agree with that. Now, before we get started this morning, I thought it would take a quick moment to mention something. As you already know, last week was the final message on the Sermon on the Mount series. And so as I was preparing this sermon for today, I began wondering just exactly how much time we spent working through the Sermon on the Mount. And how much time did Kenny devote to this passage of Scripture? So I went back and counted on YouTube how many messages there have been since we started that endeavor. And I'm sure this number's not exact, but I believe that I'm in the ballpark when I say that there were somewhere around 38 to 40 sermons in that series. His handout last week said that it was number 34, but I don't think that's including the 2 or 3 sermons apiece that Chad and I have done. I can say for certain that Kenny's first message on that series began on August the 12th of 2018. So that means we as a church have spent close to 11 months walking verse by verse through 3 chapters in the book of Matthew. And I'm sure some of you were thinking that this Sermon on the Mount series would never end. Every week we would come in, sit down, and open up our Bibles to Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. But let me tell you something. We are extremely blessed to have a pastor that has such a high view of Scripture. We never have to worry about what Sunday mornings are going to look like here at Beach Grove. We know that we're going to open our Bibles and we're going to follow along as Kenny expounds the Word of God. We know that he's going to take his time and walk us together, verse by verse, through our Bibles. So I just wanted to take a moment just to remind us how blessed we are to have Pastor Kenny and Beth. Now, Kenny approached me about a month or two ago and asked me if I would mind teaching this morning. And I told him I would love to and asked him what I needed to start studying for. He told me that now that we have finished the Sermon on the Mount, he wanted to spend some time looking at the Old Testament book of Joshua. So after some discussion, we thought it would be a good idea if I could do an introduction to the book today and kind of set the scene for us. That way, when he gets back next week, he can pick up with chapter 1 and begin looking at some of the highlights of the book. Now, I know there are many of you in here this morning that have read the book of Joshua. So you're very familiar with the timeline of the Old Testament. You know the major themes, and you know how one event leads into the next. And so you will not be caught off guard when I say that the book of Joshua begins with the Israelites crossing over the Jordan River and committing holy war against the peoples of Canaan in order to take their land. You already know that God commanded the Israelites to go into the land and basically kill everything that moves. He ordered them to kill all the women, the men, and the children in the land. But I'm reasonably confident that there are just as many present, if not more, who are not as familiar with these things. They're not really sure how this book of Joshua fits into the wider context of the Bible. They don't understand how God could command Israel to do these things. And I'm almost positive that there are people here who could potentially be disturbed by some of the content that's found in this book. And for that reason, I'm going to try and present the biblical narrative as plain and straightforward as I can make it, which means that we're going to be in our Bibles the majority of the time this morning. Now, my goal is not to spend a lot of time talking about the man, Joshua, as much as it is to take us back and walk us through the Bible text that explain to us why Joshua was leading this nation of Israel into the land of Canaan. And I'm sure that throughout the next few weeks, Kenny's going to make sure that you know about the man Joshua and his faith. I want to make sure that the book of Joshua is set into its proper historical and redemptive context. But before we jump into the text, I want to spend a moment and explain why I'm choosing to do this introduction this way. It's not original with me, but you have heard me say before that a text without a context is a pretext for misbehavior. That sentiment holds especially true for the book of Joshua. Without the book of Joshua being set in its proper context, some of the events that took place in this book are very unsettling. And that is why liberal theologians and secular professors love the book of Joshua. Without a proper understanding of what God is accomplishing in this book, it's easy to paint God as some sort of immoral monster who commands genocide on a whole group of people without cause. It's easy to see him as this God who sets up all these arbitrary rules that have no place in our modern culture. So I want to make sure that we as a church understand that these arguments are not new and that they should not make us cast doubt upon God. And by way of example, I want to make a comparison for you. One of the teachers of the early church was a man named Marcion. And he struggled with these passages in the Old Testament where God displays his wrath and God displays his displeasure. But rather than submitting to what the text plainly states, Marcion developed a way of thinking that allowed him to sidestep this Old Testament God. And his new thoughts ended up costing him dearly. Think about this. We believe that Christ died in either 30 or 33 AD. Now, as early as 144 AD, so barely over 100 years after Christ's death, Marcion was excommunicated from the church, and he's gone down in history as having a specific heresy named after him. Marcion had come to the conclusion that the God of the Old Testament was a spiteful and wrathful deity, and he was therefore subservient to the God of the New Testament. Because of texts like this of Joshua, Marcion concluded that there were two gods, one of the Old Testament Hebrew and another of the New Testament Christian. It's called the Marcionite heresy. So for my fellow Bible nerds, there's something to research this week. Look up this man Marcion and some of his deeds. But for the rest of you, you say, well, that's neat, I guess, but what does that have to do with today? How is what Marcion did all that time ago relevant to me? And I'm glad you asked. I want to take a poll. How many of you in here have watched Charles Stanley preach on TV? Just about everybody in here. Now, how many of you have heard of his son, Andy Stanley? Quite a few of us. Andy Stanley is currently pastor of North Point Community Church down in Alpharetta, Georgia. And he's recently got himself in trouble. He's come under criticism for some statements that he made during a sermon series this past year. In this sermon, he stated that the Christian faith must unhitch from the Old Testament. Okay? He's saying that we must separate the New Testament from the Old Testament. And I don't want to take him out of context. So here are a few direct quotes from an interview that he gave about the remarks that he made in that sermon. He said, "I am convinced that we make a better case for Jesus if we leave the Old Testament or the Old Covenant out of the argument. We can make a better case for Jesus than the case Jesus made for himself." He says, "It's the same God, but he was doing two different things. And all that differentiating between those things is so important." Again, in this sermon, I said, hey, it's time that we face the fact and unhitch our faith and our practice from some of these Old Testament values that we can appreciate in their original context, but we really don't have any business dragging them into a modern context. He goes on to say, I am convinced for the sake of this generation and the next generation, we have to rethink our apologetic as Christians. And the less we depend on the Old Testament to prop up our New Testament faith, the better. Because of where we are in the culture. Further down, he says, if the Bible is the foundation of your faith, here's the problem. It's all or nothing. Christianity becomes a fragile house of cards religion. And finally, he says, now for you and me, it's much easier for us to embrace all of those things as historical, primarily because of how we were raised. But I totally get when a 25-year-old or a 35-year-old comes to faith in Jesus and then starts reading the Old Testament. They're kind of looking like, really? Well, you know, that's difficult, but that doesn't undermine my faith And I would never press somebody to say, well, if you can't accept all of it as historically true, then you can't really be a Christian. I think that's a little bit absurd. Now, you can see in this that Andy is not, I want to be clear, he's not committing to the heresy of Marcionism. But I can't say he's flirting with it. Essentially, he's saying that, yeah, I agree there is one God, but that God was doing two different things, which is incorrect, by the way. Andy Stanley is saying that God had one plan for the Old Testament period and a different plan for the New Testament period. That Old Testament God was very concerned with keeping specific laws. He was very wrathful and at times very harsh. Whereas in the New Testament, you have this guy Jesus who is accepting, he's graceful, he's merciful, and he just exudes love. Andy Stanley believes that when it comes to evangelizing and witnessing to people about Jesus in our current culture, these Old Testament texts like Joshua get in the way. They're embarrassing and they're hard to explain. Therefore, we should just unhitch ourselves from them and focus entirely on Jesus. Now again, I want to be very clear. I am not singling Andy Stanley out to call him a heretic. Please don't hear me say that. And I'm not trying to be mean towards him, and I'm not saying that everything he produces is bad. I'm just trying to make the point that it's easy to be led down the wrong road by someone with good intentions. It's easy to open up our Old Testaments, read through some of the events that took place, and be bothered by them. I presume that Andy Stanley has a good heart, and he wants to reach lost people. And he feels like the Old Testament just muddies the water. Why keep it when you have to spend so much time trying to defend God from His actions? Let's just quit making excuses for God. Let's stop trying to defend Him, and let's just unhitch from the Old Testament and leave it behind. Now, church, this is a modern pastor with a very big name and a very big church just right down the road from us in Georgia. And the reason I say these things is because I want us to see that these arguments are not relics from the past that have no significance. They are modern and they are relevant. Now, I want to give you another quote, this time from R.C. Sproul. This is what he has to say. Among the countless nuggets of wisdom I have received over the years from my father is this bit of gold. When you are reading your Bible and you come across something that makes you uncomfortable, resist the temptation to simply move on to something else. Where the Bible makes us uncomfortable is precisely where we need to slow down. It is compelling evidence of a specific weakness. When our thoughts or feelings bristle under God's Word, He is right and we are wrong. That said, it is understandable that so many would recoil from God's command that every living person in Canaan be put to death as His people conquered the land. No mercy for those women and children, no compassion on the aged. God's instructions were as clear as they were brutal. And many outside of the faith have planted their flag here, arguing that our God is immoral and monstrous. Many on the fringes of the faith perform sundry exegetical gymnastics to wiggle out from under the account. And many faithful believers are simply puzzled and embarrassed. The God we worship, however, the true and living God, did in fact give this command. And rightly so. If we would rightly worship Him, even here we would praise His name. And I agree with Sproul's sentiment. So this morning, by way of introduction, I want us to slow down. I want us to step back from the book of Joshua and see if we can get the big picture. I think this will be beneficial to those who are familiar with the biblical narrative, as well as beneficial to those who are not. So let's ask the question, what was going on here? Why did God command these things? And to do that, I want us to go back to the beginning. Let's rewind the story all the way back to the garden. And I'm going to try to lead us on a tour through the first half of Genesis. So if you have a Bible, get it out and follow along with me, okay? We're going to be skimming through these passages fairly quickly. If you turn to Genesis, you will notice that in chapters 1 through 3, we have the account of the creation and the fall of Adam and Eve. Okay, if you skip on over to Genesis 4, we read the story where Canaan kills his brother Abel and the consequences of that decision. In chapter 5, we see a set of genealogical records. Now, the purpose of these records are twofold. One, they allow us to trace out the messianic line. Okay? Through the genealogies, we can see the promised seed through Adam all the way to Jesus. But the second thing that the genealogies do for us is they introduce us to important players in the game. Okay? They show us the key figures. In this instance, the genealogy says, okay, here's Adam, and here are Adam's descendants, and then the next key figures in the biblical narrative are Noah and his 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Okay, so both of these things are occurring in this genealogy of Genesis 5. So chapter 5 ends, and we pick up with chapter 6. And this is the account of the flood. And I want to pause here because it never ceases to amaze me how fast humanity went corrupt. Literally, 6 chapters into the Bible, and we run into this scenario. Chapter 6 explains how God saw that man's wickedness on the earth was great, and He declared that the thoughts of man's heart were continually evil. And for that reason, He would blot out mankind. Okay? This is critically important. Let's ask the question, why did God choose to do this? Why is God going to kill everyone on the planet in Genesis 6? And the answer is that it was a righteous judgment against sin. Okay? Make sure you catch that. God was placing a moral judgment upon the people of the earth. They are wicked, and therefore I'm going to destroy them. And as the sovereign creator, He makes the rules. He is the one who has the right to say that the punishment for moral iniquity is death. And so that is what He does. He drowns the whole earth except for 8 people, which is Noah and his family. Now we also need to understand here that Noah and his family members were not some righteous elite. They did not earn their right to be on that boat. They were sinners as well. And as we'll see in a moment, 2 of the 8 will commit acts of gross sin pretty much as soon as they step off the boat. Now, that being Noah and Ham. So, what I'm trying to say here is that their presence on the boat was an act of unmerited grace from God. God had a plan, and He chose to carry that plan out through these 8 broken people. So the main takeaways from Genesis 6 is 1, the flood is a result of a moral judgment against wickedness. 2, at the same time, God used 8 sinful people to carry out His plan of judgment and redemption. I'm stressing this point because this is also the theme that's running through Joshua. It's the very same concept. God just works out the details differently. So let's continue in Genesis. We've got chapters 6, 7, and 8. All 3 of these chapters are concerned with the flood narrative. So let's fast forward to chapter 9. And this is where God makes His covenant with Noah. But I want us to focus on specifically is verses 18 through 27. Verse 18 says, "The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth." And then it says, Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the 3 sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the whole earth. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Ham, again, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his 2 brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father naked. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." So the flood subsides, they come off the boat, and we know what Noah does, right? He plants a vineyard, he takes the fruit of that vineyard, and he becomes drunk. He passes out in his tent. One of his sons, Ham, does something to Noah. And there are several theories as to what this indiscretion was. I'm not going to speculate on it here. Suffice suffice it to say, Noah was not pleased. But what is interesting here is if you look at verses 18 through 24, 2 times it specifically points out that Ham was the father of Canaan. Canaan is the name of Ham's son, and his sons will become known as, you guessed it, the Canaanites. So let's ask the question, why would the biblical writers make it a point to repeatedly tell us that Ham's descendants are the Canaanites? And here's what we need to take away from this. Ham's descendants, through the line of Canaan, are going to fall into the same cycle of wickedness that he did. Ham was a wicked man, and his descendants through Canaan are going to be wicked as well. History and archaeology have proved that this was indeed the case. The Canaanites were some of the most wicked people the world has ever known. Now, I have to stop here and say that when I was preparing this sermon, I came close to listing out some of the grievous sins that the Canaanites were guilty of. That night I was sitting at the kitchen table working on this while my wife Leslie was cooking supper. And I got to this point of the sermon and I wrote out 2 or 3 of these sins. And then I stopped and I started asking Leslie, I said, do you think this would be appropriate to say some of these things from the pulpit? They're pretty rough. And we agreed that it's in God's Word and therefore it should be fine to point it out. But I chose not to. I will simply say this. Their sexual immorality knew no bounds. Their worship of false gods was as wicked gets, even to the point of sacrificing their own children to the false god of Molech. And then I started thinking about the culture that we currently live in. The rampant immorality, the abomination that is abortion. I mean, how many children have we as a nation sacrificed on the altar of lust and convenience? And the more I thought about it, the more I began questioning my previous comment about Canaan being the most vile nation the world has ever known. To be honest, at this point, I think America would give Canaan a run for its money. I tend to agree with something that I heard Billy Graham say one time. And he said that if God doesn't judge America, He's going to owe Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. It may be worthwhile to mention that Sodom and Gomorrah was in the land of Canaan. But I just want to remind us that we need to pray for ourselves. We need to pray for our neighbors and our communities. And we need to pray for our nation. We are not above receiving God's judgment. God is no respecter of persons. All right, so chapter 9 comes to a close and chapter 10 begins. And this time, Noah's 3 sons have their genealogies recorded. In my ESV Bible, their descendants are labeled as nations. Okay? At the end of each grouping, which is verses 5, 20, 31, and 32, the passage concludes with this phrase. These are the clans of so-and-so, and by their clans, their languages, and their lands, and their nations. Which tells me these weren't just a few offspring. Okay? These genealogies are cluing us in on the fact that out of these 3 men came vast people groups that spread all throughout the region. And it goes without saying that this took some time. This didn't happen overnight. So out of these 3 men come nations of people. And we fast forward to chapter 11, and we have the account of the Tower of Babel. And this is where God confuses the language of the people and He spreads them throughout the whole earth. Now at this point, you're all saying, what in the world does this have to do with the book of Joshua? Why are you spending so much time in Genesis? Hang with me for just a few more minutes. We're getting it. Now at the end of chapter 11, there's another genealogy. This time it is specifically focused in on Noah's son Shem. And Shem's family tree concludes with a man named Terah. And Terah had a son named Abram. Okay? In verses 29 and 30, we are told a couple of details about Abram that are critical to the rest of the story. First, he is married to a woman named Sarai. The second is that they are married. Abram is 75 years old, and he has no heir. He has no child of his own. And we need to know these things because they're important to the story. Okay, so this man Abram is a very important character in the Bible. And we're going to see why in chapter 12. Now, chapter 12 in Genesis marks a kind of turning point in the book. Up to this point, the focus has been on major events. If you were trying to create an outline for the book, it would say the creation, the fall, the flood, and the spreading out of the nations. From Genesis 12 all the way to the end of the book, the outline would focus on 4 people. It would be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The whole rest of the book essentially follows the events of these 4 men's lives. But the one that we're concerned with today is Abram. In Genesis 12, God is going to deal with Abram in a way that he hasn't others up to this point. So let's look at some of the special dynamics of this relationship. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 9. Let's read it. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all of their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. Okay, some very important details here that pertain to the book of Joshua. The Lord came to Abram and he made him a threefold promise. The first promise is that God told Abram he would make him a great nation. Abram is 75 years old. He has no son. Yet God says, "I'm going to make a nation come forth from you." Obviously, he's speaking of the Israelite people. So make sure you understand that the Israelite nation is Abram's offspring. The second promise was that God promised Abram's offspring a land. More specifically, in verse 7, it is the land of Canaan. So you're beginning to see how this leads into Joshua. It's right here that God says to Abraham, "I'm going to give your offspring the land of Canaan." So even though they don't exist yet, God just gave them the land. And finally, God promises Abram that he will be blessed and that he will be a blessing to the whole earth. Now, this is a reference to the messianic line that will pass through Abraham's descendants. Jesus is a descendant of Abram, and therefore all of the earth was blessed through Abraham. Now, let's move on. Genesis 13 and 14 cover some major events that occur in Abram's life, which I wish we could cover, but time just will not permit us to do that. So what I want us to do is go to Genesis 15. This is the chapter that gives us the Abrahamic covenant. In this chapter, Abraham is worried. He's worried about God's promise of an offspring. Many years have passed since God came and visited him in chapter 12. And he's worried that he's going to die and have to leave everything to his servant Eliezer of Damascus. And God says, "No. Abram, look at the stars of the sky. Your offspring are going to be the same way. There's going to be so many of them that you can't count them." And at this point, God tells Abram to go get this certain group of animals. And Abram does as he's told. He gets the animals, he cuts them in half. Then in verse 12, a deep sleep comes on Abram, and he sees a vision. Skip down to verse 17. In the vision, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passes through the animals. The smoking fire pot and the flaming torch represent God. And notice that only God passes through the animal halves. Right? This is not Abram and God making an agreement together. This is God saying to Abram, I will fulfill my promise to you, Abram. And if I don't, let what happened to these animals happen to me. And we know that God's promises are as good as done. But I skipped over something. If you back up to verses 13 through 16, God says something pretty incredible to Abram. Let's look at it together. Verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on that nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now you understand what's happening here, right? Abram doesn't have a single child yet God is foretelling him about the Egyptians enslaving his offspring, the Israelite people, and holding them captive for 400 years. Then after 400 years, God is going to bring them out of captivity with great possessions. Now our minds should immediately start to think about the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, because that's the event that this passage is referencing. Now look at verse 15. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation. Now look at this next line. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Make sure you read verse 16 and let it soak in. God is telling Abram that after the Israelite people are rescued from Egypt, when the 400 years or 4 generations are completed, He's going to bring them back into this land. And why is He going to wait that long? For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The Amorites are one of the major people groups from the land of Canaan. If you look at the end of chapter 15 in verses 18 and 19, they are named as one of the groups that live in the land that God is going to give to Israel. Okay. When I started this lesson this morning, I said many people don't know what to do with the book of Joshua, because in it, God orders the extermination of all of these people groups. Yet, all the way back in Genesis 15, we see God saying to Abram that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Do you understand that God let this wicked people dwell in the land of Canaan, a land described as flowing with milk and honey, for a minimum of 400 years before He brought judgment upon them? Far from being a mean and vindictive God, this is a God of long suffering and a God of patience. This is a God who extends grace to a wicked people for hundreds of years before He brings the hammer down. When we went through Genesis 6 this morning, I made it a point to say that the flood was a judgment against mankind for their immorality. And God used 8 sinful people and a boat as tools to accomplish His purpose. The book of Joshua paints the same picture. But instead of a worldwide flood, God uses the people of Israel, who are themselves sinful, as a tool to cleanse the wickedness from the land of Canaan. In Deuteronomy 9, God reminds the Israelite people that they are not inheriting the land because they are righteous. They are taking the land from the Canaanites because God is judging them. Let's look at Deuteronomy 9, 1 through 8. It says, "Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today, to go into the dispossessed nations greater and mightier than you, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the sons of Anakim, whom you know, and of whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak? Know therefore today that He who goes over before you as a consuming fire is the Lord your God. He will destroy them and subdue them before you. So you shall drive them out and make them perish quickly, as the Lord has promised you. Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, It is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of the nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you. And that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Know therefore that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are stubborn. Remember, and do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness. From the day you came out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place, you have been rebellious against the Lord. Even at Horeb, you provoked the Lord to wrath. And the Lord was so angry with you that he was ready to destroy you. I don't know how to say it any clearer than what we just read. It is not the nation of Israel who decided to go in and take these lands and kill these people. It is God who commanded these things. And he did it as a moral judgment against the wickedness of these people. Israel was simply a tool in God's hand. And I know we sometimes push back at concepts like these, but I think these passages magnify God in ways that should drive us to our knees. Because we need to be reminded that God is sovereign over the affairs of the world. He raises nations up and he casts nations down. He gives, he takes away. He sees the wickedness of this world, and he does not turn a blind eye to injustice. And I think it would do us all good to be reminded that the flood in Genesis 6, the judgment of the Canaanites in the book of Joshua, will pale in comparison to the judgment that is unleashed when King Jesus comes again. Now, I hope we all have a better understanding of what God was accomplishing when he commanded the Israelites to do these things. But I don't want to abandon our timeline just yet. I want us to push on just for a few more minutes so that we can clearly see the biblical and historical context around the book of Joshua. So let's think back to our timeline for a second. I said the second half of the book of Genesis is focused on the lives of four people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now don't forget that Joseph is the one who leads the Israelites into Egypt, where they eventually become enslaved. After Genesis, what comes next? The book of Exodus. Exodus is the book, in the book of Exodus, we have the story of the 400 years of captivity that God promised would happen, and then the story of God using Moses to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. He leads them to the base of Mount Sinai, and God inaugurates his covenant with the people of Israel. Now, this covenant is different from the Abrahamic covenant. It was conditional. It was conditional on the basis of Israel's faithfulness. If they obeyed, then God would bless them and they could stay in the land. If they disobeyed, then God would punish them and they would be cast out of the land. And this book also establishes the building of the tabernacle and the rules and the regulations that went with it. And then after the book of Exodus, we have the book of Leviticus. And the theme of Leviticus is God's holiness. If God is going to dwell in the midst of his people by the way of the tabernacle, then the Israelites are going to have to conform to his standards. This book is where God gives Israel his laws. God places his regulations over every aspect of Israelite life. Through these laws, he is creating a peculiar people, a chosen people who are to be a light to the rest of the world. And you know why he's doing this? Two reasons. One, it gives us a visual representation of the holiness of God. God is perfect. We can't keep his laws. And therefore, he's perfect. His demands are perfect. And he demands perfection from his followers. Except that we can't pull it off. We are unable to live in sinless perfection. And so we cry out for a Savior. Right? The law drives us to Jesus. But the second purpose in giving these laws is so that the Israelites can avoid one of the dirtiest words in the Hebrew language. And that word is syncretism. Syncretism occurs when you take elements of one religion and you mix it with another. And so what you wind up with is a religion that isn't quite Jewish, and it isn't fully pagan. It's this weird combination of the two. And so in Leviticus, God gives these Jewish people His rules for life, His rules for worship, His rules for food, His rules for clothing, His rules as to what constitutes clean versus unclean, so that they won't defile themselves by becoming like the Canaanites. And here's the thing. God already knows that the Israelites are not going to fully obey His command to cleanse the land. Even though God commands them to kill all the pagan peoples of the land, they don't follow through. They let some of the people live. And guess what happens? Syncretism occurs. Which is why the book that follows Joshua, the book of Judges, is so dark. In Judges, you have the Israelites who are enamored with the false god of Baal, and you have the Jews who are setting up Asherah poles. And these are all consequences of syncretism. They are the results of not following through with God's original command to cleanse the land. But all the while, God's standards are standing firm. His law is fixed. And so the whole rest of the Old Testament is the story of Israel's failure to live up to God's standards and their failure to keep their part of the covenant. And consequently, the discipline that God brings for their disobedience, where He does, in fact, eventually cast them out of the land. But we're not there yet. After Leviticus comes the book of Numbers. And Numbers gets its name from the census that is taken at the beginning of the book and the census that is taken at the end of the book. Numbers is the book where Moses leads the people to the promised land of Canaan for the first time. It is in this book, in chapter 13, where the spies are sent into the land of Canaan. And you know what happens. Joshua and Caleb are the only spies that return to camp and say, let's go. And sadly, they get outvoted. And Israel doesn't take the land. This lack of faith resulted in Israel having to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Until that faithless generation died. And when they were all gone, God led them back to the promised land. God was going to remain faithful to Abraham. He was going to keep His promise to give this land to Abram's offspring. But before we go into the land, we have to deal with the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy literally means second law. In this book, Moses pauses before the people go into the promised land so that he can remind the people of the laws that God had given them in Leviticus. He was reminding them that if they want to remain in the land and receive God's blessing, then they must remain faithful to the covenant. So Deuteronomy is literally a second telling of God's law. Deuteronomy closes, and the stage is set for Joshua. He is ready to cross over the Jordan and take the land. Now, for those of you that are interested, the book of Joshua is outlined like this. In chapters 1 through 5, they cross over the Jordan into the land that I have given you. In chapters 6 through 12, take the land that I have given you. In chapters 13 through 21, divide the land that I have given you. And in chapters 22 through 24, serve the Lord in the land that I have given you. So you have cross, take, divide, and serve. And I don't know about you, but it helps me to break these chapters down into manageable chunks. And I would encourage all of you, take some time this next week and read the book of Joshua. That way we will all be ready to go when Kenny gets back next week. All right, before we close this morning, I want to look at one more passage. This time from the book of Joshua itself. It is one of my favorite sections of the whole book. Let's look at Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. Verse 13. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked. And behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us, or are you for our adversaries? Right? So Joshua encounters this mighty warrior on the way to Jericho. And this warrior has a sword in his hand, and his sword is drawn. And he's ready for combat. And Joshua approaches him and asks him a very important question. Whose team are you on? And now this is what we call an either-or question. Okay? Either you are for us or you are for them. Now, which is it? And let's look at the warrior's response, verse 14. And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. And now I have come." The warrior responds to Joshua's question by saying no. And Joshua's thinking, wait a minute, that's not really an option here. You're either for us or against us. You can't be neutral in this situation. But by responding with the answer no, and declaring that he was the commander of the army of the Lord, the warrior is essentially saying, Joshua, this is my war. And the real question here is whether or not you are on my team. Joshua gets the gravity of the situation, and he responds appropriately. Let's keep reading. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. I think this is a good place to close. Joshua encountered what is known as a Christophany. A Christophany is a manifestation of the pre-incarnate Christ. And so Joshua knew that worship was the right response to what was taking place. I hope that as we work through this book of Joshua, we find ourselves doing the same thing. I pray that we would see God in all His sovereign goodness. See Him in His majesty as a punisher of evil. That we would see God as a mighty warrior with His sword drawn. But that we would also see Him as a God who is long-suffering. That we would see Him as a God who shows kindness to the most wicked among us. I pray that our eyes would be awakened to the Bible as one complete revelation of God's work of redemption. I pray that we see all that God has accomplished, and it would drive us to worship Him. So Beech Grove, I'm going to conclude this morning by saying that there's no reason you should be ashamed of the book of Joshua or any other book of the Old Testament. There's gold in these pages if we will slow down and take the time to dig it out. I'm not sure where Kenny's going to pick up next week. He may go back to the book of Numbers and look at the faith of the man Joshua during the incident with the spies, or he may jump into Joshua chapter 1. Either way, I'm looking forward to it. Now, I know I unloaded a ton of information on you this morning, and I understand it looked more like a Sunday school class than it did a sermon. But I hope that you will walk away from here with a greater understanding and a greater appreciation for the historical and the redemptive purposes of God in the Old Testament. Steve.